We are excited to move on to a panel discussion on greenwashing. A warm applause for Ursula Bittner, economic expert at Greenpeace Austria, Julia Arbery, partner at StoneTurn, Nadine Hönighaus, managing director econsense, and Thomas Krick, managing director of ESG solutions at EQS Group.
Dear viewers, the theme for this panel discussion is environmental, social, greenwashing. What is there to trust? But first, let me welcome my panelists. Welcome, everyone. If you could briefly say what you do and where your focus is, and so then we have a good introduction for the panel. Julia,
Perfect.
starting with you.
Thank you, Tanya. My name's Julia Arbery. I'm a partner with StoneTurn. We are a forensic advisory firm that has been in Germany now for 5 years in relation to compliance and ethics.
Great. Thomas, we've seen you here today, but for the viewers who haven't yet seen you today.
Yep, thank you. My name's Thomas Krick. I've basically been doing corporate sustainability and ESG for the last 20 years in various roles in consulting and in think tanks and research. I now lead the EQS efforts to develop software for companies that develop software to help companies progress on their path towards sustainability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. Ursula.
Yeah, my name is Ursula Bittner. I'm an an economic expert at Greenpeace Austria, Greenpeace Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm working in very different fields from compliance, civil society, biodiversity, climate, agriculture.
And very different industries, no doubt, as well. Okay, Nadine, if you could quickly introduce yourself again. I know you've just given a wonderful presentation, but for those viewers who are joining us now for the benefit of the panel discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, and I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in the studio. My name is Nadine Hönighaus. I'm the executive director of a large company business network on sustainability in Germany called econsense. We currently have 46 large member companies from all different kinds of sectors that interact and exchange in our networks to advance their sustainability practices.
Great. Thank you, Nadine. So first, I'd like to take a look at what greenwashing is and then at ways to prevent greenwashing and how to hold companies accountable for this malpractice. As we already had a session today about greenwashing in the finance sector with Desiree Fixler, I'd like to focus this discussion on the real economy. So greenwashing, whether it's deliberate or unintentional, is overstating your product or company's sustainable attributes. It can take many forms. It can take the form of unsubstantiated claims on packaging, such as all natural, conscious, ethical, biodegradable, sustainable, more sustainable, and so on. And this is confusing for consumers like myself for various reasons. There doesn't seem to be a standardized definition of key terms globally. Certificates aren't transparent and make it difficult to directly compare products or services that are on the shelf, products that are on the shelf. And equally, the science on sustainability is changing, and companies and individuals themselves might find it hard to do the right thing. For example, as we've heard today from Ursula, offsetting CO2 might have seemed like a good idea a few years ago. Now it's considered insufficient in the fight against climate change. And in the worst case of greenwashing, companies that are in industries that are actually the main contributors to CO2 emissions, they use greenwashing as a deliberate technique to distract consumers from the fact that their business model and their activities actually do a lot of environmental damage or harm human rights. So here are some famous examples from various industries. And it's not just these industries that are involved in this, but here are some examples that have been most prominent in the press. So for example, for the automotive industry, Volkswagen cheating on emissions testing by fitting vehicles with a defect device. And I think they've learned from that misconduct, but still, that was one of the most famous ones. Then fossil fuels. There's ongoing US congressional hearings investigating Chevron, Exxon, Shell, and BP for their role in driving climate change, while at the same time greenwashing and even gaslighting. In the aviation industry, Air France and KLM is currently being sued by environmental groups over an advertising campaign that they allege breaches European consumer law by misleading the public over how sustainable the flights are. And in the consumer goods industry, in 2018, Nestlé, the world's largest food and beverage company, announced its ambition for its packaging to be 100% recyclable or reusable by 2025, without indeed a clear timeline and additional efforts to help facilitate recycling by consumers. And in brand audits across the globe conducted, Nestlé is consistently identified as one of the top plastic polluters. Then in fashion, this year, the apparel and textile industry's leading alliance for sustainable production, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, stopped using its product sustainability tool due to greenwashing criticisms from consumers and campaigners complaining about the methodology for life cycle assessment. That was called the Higg Material Sustainability Index, so actually from an association that should be doing better. And those are just a few examples. So enough from me. Thomas, let's have a look from the company's point of view. Why are they doing it? What do they have to benefit from greenwashing?
Well, I think there are many potential reasons. And as a blanket statement, I don't think it's commonly particularly intentional that companies say or think, oh, we're just going to lie to consumers and customers. Instead, I believe it's often born out of a lack of understanding. Sustainability is a really complex concept, and we can define it fairly well on a general level. I mean, Attenborough had this nice recent definition of saying everything that you cannot do forever is not sustainable. That's nice on a very general level, but once we start asking whether a specific product, a service, or even an entire company, or even an entire supply chain and value chain is sustainable, we quickly find that it's not so clear-cut anymore. And maybe I can just illustrate that with a seemingly simple example. Take, for example, packaging. We had the Nestlé example you managed. Should we package our product in plastics? Is that sustainable? Well, most plastic doesn't biodegrade very well, and therefore stays in nature for a really long time. So most people think of the millions of tons of plastic floating in the oceans, polluting our rivers and our lands, and saying, no way, plastic is like totally unsustainable. So what's the alternative? Well, somebody comes up with biodegradable plastic, and it's like, oh yeah, biodegradable plastic, problem solved. and what happens? Lots of consumer companies jump all over it, and they put biodegradable plastic into their packaging, and they write, it's a sustainable packaging, and it's almost a sustainable product then on the packaging, and then they sell it, and it sells, and it's great. What goes lost is that this plastic only biodegrades under very certain circumstances. It needs particular bacteria, microbes, potentially temperatures, some oxygenation, circumstances which are a lot of the time not present with this stuff. It's the landfill. So in theory, it's sustainable, but in practice, it's actually, just as long in the environment as usual.
Okay, so you're addressing a point that the science on what is more sustainable is not 100% clear. Ursula, what would you say to that?
Well, of course, science change, and there are new researchers coming up. I totally believe that. But I would not say that companies have not an idea or that they are not intentionally lying to consumers. I think they do intentionally lie to consumer because it's much more expensive and there are much more costs to really check your supply chains, to really be transparent, to have audits, to have documentation. And we learned for a long time, also in university, do what you can best, outsource the rest, and then bring the labor to cheap countries. That's what I learned at university. So it's a very old meaning of how economic works, and I think a lot of companies only just decide by economic decisions. They do not decide if this is good for the environment, if this is socially okay or not. They just decide what gets more profits, and we have to be honest like that most of the companies work like that they have the duty to their shareholders. It's not about environment. But additionally, as I said also in my presentation today, it's not only about intentionally or not intentionally. Even though a company is not intentionally greenwash, it's still greenwashing. I mean, in the past, maybe we could say we can decide between intentionally and not intentionally, but not anymore, because companies are aware of sustainability. They know they have to invest in research, even though they invest by themselves, as they invest in hygiene or in security. They need to take environment as serious as all the other parameters my economic production, I would say. So this is still greenwashing for me, and they have to take the responsibility to really fulfill a sustainable supply chains, and also lobby that by themselves for strong laws. It's even better also for companies if they have a level playing field. So all companies have to be sustainable, like whatever that means that and that in that point, but have some clear and transparent supply chains. It's even better for the company also, I believe.
But there we already have the next problem, that there doesn't seem to be a level playing field, as Nadine was explaining in her presentation. Oh, excuse me. Julia, is it more common in certain industries, or what other factors contribute to the breeding ground for greenwashing?
Well, I think in your introduction you already outlined that it's we are seeing cases across the different industries. You have retail, you have oil and gas, you have automotive, aviation. So I don't think we can say it's one industry more than another, but more we have to go back to what is the definition? What is greenwashing? And we've seen it's a misrepresentation of facts. And generally, you have then what are the fraud indicators in those situations that encourage, that are the breeding ground for misrepresentation, for wrong statements. It's the pressure and the opportunity. And yes, the pressures will be higher where there's more noise in the press and in the stakeholders are starting to look into what does that mean, green, in this context. So where you're more hidden, you may have more opportunity. But I think we need to go back to what we see as the key indicators and look at where the pressures lie and have more scrutiny to identify the areas where there is misrepresentation. And I don't think it's unintentional, by the way.
But would it be fair to say that the companies that are most polluting, be they fossil fuel companies or plastic producing companies, are actually the ones who do the worst greenwashing, because they're also pretending they're green while, as you mentioned in your presentation, lobbying behind the scenes for complete opposite legislation?
I think we just only see the tip of the iceberg at the moment, and we're learning and we're on a journey to understand where there are these issues, and to some extent we may not fully understand our footprint yet, and then there may be the lack of intention, but I do agree with you also that it's our, if we're in an organization, it is our duty to understand what our footprint is and to make sure that any statements that we are making are accurate.
Okay, let's take a look inside the companies. What are the sort of breeding grounds within companies that are more likely to lead to that sort of behavior, greenwashing? Because those decisions are taken at the top, aren't they?
Absolutely, and I think it comes back to our key learnings from a lot of compliance scandals and larger issues that we've seen is what are the key elements of your program? What is your culture? What are the behaviors that you see in your organization? What are you incentivizing? And that usually is then the behaviors that you're fostering. So what are your speak-up mechanisms? Are employees able to raise concerns around the statements that are being made to the shareholder, the consumer, the different stakeholders? And can they challenge their leadership if they feel that there is misrepresentation going on? And in those organizations where you do not have that culture and that opportunity to identify risks of misrepresentations, there the risk is higher that things are not being published transparently.
Okay, but what about if companies are incentivizing profit, which they do? Is that then the core problem? Are we looking at a business model problem?
I think there's a balance, and you need to put your priorities at the same level that you're supporting ethical conduct, environmental friendly conduct in line with the profit. At the end of the day, of course, the organizations will need to make money to be sustainable as well, and they need to foster those priorities.
Ursula, I must ask you, do you agree? Does profit and ethical behavior go hand in hand? Is there a balance to be had there?
That's a difficult question, I would say. I mean, at the moment, we're still working in this belief we need to grow, and I don't need to mention that we have not endless possibilities to grow on our planet, obviously. So we have to change more or less the industry, like coming back to like reuse, more services, more other business models, not like producing, throwing away. I mean, the question is also, a general question is, can a company which is a multi-corporation, like a big furniture company you all know, I guess, can companies like that be sustainable? I mean, this is like a cynical question maybe, but it's the basic question is like, can every company be sustainable? And I think that sustainability and environment and climate, that should be like on the top when managers make decisions. I think this is also one hurdle, like to really avoid greenwashing, is this habits of how we work and how we do business, and that this must be changed. There must be a cultural change also in companies and especially on the top.
Okay. Nadine, I'd like to bring you into the discussion. So if you were to set up a company and you want to prove your ESG credentials, because you've been working hard at it and you're doing a good job, and of course you want to promote yourself, but not too much, how do you prove sustainability without greenwashing? So how can you separate green facts from greenwashing fiction?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit puzzled by the discussion, I have to admit, because the tone brings me back to times where at least when I'm with businesses in dialogue, we're not there anymore. And the type of the way we discuss has been changed fundamentally with the UN SDGs in 2015, that really precisely said that business has to be part of the solution, is a part of the solution, and that acknowledges low carbon growth within planetary boundaries as something that is, as terms of growth that can enhance sustainability on a planetary level. And that's how we live the spirit of companies engaging on sustainability. I also do not like the view of companies being like somewhere on the side of society, which is not the case. There are people working in companies and they are as much cross-cutting cut of the society as others are. So if you think that within companies and the dialogue on sustainability is less intense than somewhere outside on the streets, I can tell you this is not the case. You do have grassroots movements, employees hold their employers accountable for what they're promising, and particularly on increasingly competitive labor markets, it is a huge issue that you really walk the talk as a company too. So companies are parts of society, and of course I do see that really taking sustainability, really holistically integrating it into strategy, into target setting, into global processes among different cultures and units, that's a huge challenge for companies. And thinking sustainability like from not only from the factory gate, but from cradle to grave, increasingly imposes a lot of questions on companies. There needs to be intelligence within these units that really thinks that it is a journey, it is understanding, it needs to have a backbone in governance. Desiree said that what is said from the top can be really trickled down into business units, that the top line messaging and strategy is really lived in the very tiniest units, from product development to recycling, all, you name the whole cycle. What we see is that companies do not rely on what they can do as such anymore. I'm really happy that we have initiatives like the Science-Based Target Initiative, for example, that clearly helps companies to get on their 1.5 degree path. And it is exactly the help and the definitions the initiatives is giving to companies. They say, we really want to see you progressing on climate. And we see the companies, the majority of our members are on an SBTi track or have already science-based targets on climates. How thorough this process really also is in terms of a cultural change, ongoing discussions within the companies. And you do not only have these processes on climate, like the SBTIs, which is huge. But you do have similar initiatives, let it be sector-based supply chain initiatives that set their own standards on the UNGPs and things like that. And wherever companies come together, often in a multi-stakeholder setting like that, I think is working against greenwashing. I do not like the term, of course, but these are the steps where you have systems of checks and balances, not only from a policy level, not only from supervisory institution and control like the Bundeskriminalamt Desiree has mentioned, but checks and balances within the system of stakeholder groups. I think these are very important.
Okay, Thomas. Sorry,
Julia,
Julia,
can I just add on that? Because
yeah.
I think, in order for us to have a more relevant conversation for the members on how they can look at their own organization and prevent misrepresentation on sustainable statements that they're making, we need to also think about that it's not just on top, but it's really around how do individuals meet their targets, their targets within the business sense of an organization, but in line with the sustainability targets, the how are they meeting their targets. So it's not just what are you doing on your day-to-day basis when I'm rewarding you for being a fantastic employee who's always there on the ground running and doing what you need to do to make money, but how did you meet them?
Right.
And by tying those together, organizations can start to change that culture that we need.
Excellent point. Thank you. Thomas, you also wanted to add something to what Nadine was saying in the beginning.
Yes. So I think a few points. You touched upon culture, and we've generally been talking about companies. I think we do have to be careful, and you went some way towards a kind of, I think, going beyond this idea that companies are, solid entities that speak with one voice and that have a unifying purpose. Really, companies are sums of people, and I must say, in those companies, there are sums of people, they work in different functions, and these different functions pursue different interests. I encounter many individuals and companies who are very committed to the cause of sustainability, but they also find themselves in a system that is not just designed to produce in a certain manner, but is also designed to satisfy shareholder needs, secure employment, deliver products to consumers that expect them. There are a lot of, it's a complex web. And so sometimes even individuals find themselves in a situation where they have two voices on their head. And there is a big, which we haven't touched upon, also a question of the organization allocation of sustainability. Desiree mentioned it earlier. I think one of the probably most common mistakes is that you have too much of a market-oriented view in this whole sustainability debate. Yes, we live in a fast-paced world. Profit is key. A new product comes to market. You want to sell it, of course. As I tried to illustrate earlier, sustainability is a complex subject, but consumer communication tends to be easy, and it's supposed to be easy. And that's a challenge, because suddenly we find ourselves with binary statements about sustainability that, they misrepresent a product, and I wouldn't call it intentional, but it is certainly reckless, and it is born out of a lack of understanding and out of a lack of effort to understand and out of a lack of respect for the seriousness of the matter. And if there's one thing, an enabler that I would see beyond kind of culture, targets, it's also just education. We need more people in companies understanding the basic concepts of sustainability, how you can kind of progress towards it, what you can say about it, what not. And that's a big lack, and I'm also seeing it, by the way, in the consumer space.
Okay. Ursula, what's the biggest hurdle to ensuring organizations are held accountable for reliable sustainability reporting, marketing, advertising, and against greenwashing? What's the biggest hurdle?
Well, also to add to that what was said, I think there is a big pressure for companies to do green, to be sustainable, because otherwise consumer maybe turn around and do not buy any products from them, making them maybe to communicate green even though they are not really green. And I think that's the point where also the regulation comes in place, the laws comes in place. And if my competitor is doing green but is not really green, so it's greenwashing, then I'm tending to maybe also greenwash, because if I'm really green, then I have much more costs, then my product gets more expensive, I lose market, and so on. So I think for this level playing field, and that's one of the hurdles, is we need laws to regulate that, and to there's on one side regulations to really can sue also a company if they greenwash. Greenwash, it sounds so nice and fluffy, a bit of greenwash. It's not like a...
Not sure Nadine agrees.
No, but yeah, that's true. Yeah, but I think it's a fraud. It's betray on consumers, because there are consumers who really pay more because it seems to be sustainable. If there's a certificate on it saying this is sustainable fish, I buy it and I think I'm doing good. But it's not good. Like all the fish certificates, it's not sustainable. If you should not eat fish, or if you eat fish, then eat it from your region. That's the way forward, and that's greenwash, but it's fraud and it's betray. And I think that's where legislation must come in, and saying if you cannot prove your claim, then you must be responsible, and not just remove the claim, but maybe also pay some penalties. It must be like a very strict thing that it's not possible anymore for companies to greenwash. And on the other hand, there must be laws like the FERC legislation I mentioned this morning, the Forest and Ecosystem Risk Commodities legislation, which hinders which forbids it to import at all products into the European market, which are causing deforestation or ecosystem destruction. There's the Sustainable Supply Chain Law. It was in place in Germany. It's a bit weak, but maybe there's a way to improve this on a European level. So there are a lot of, the Green Claim Initiative on the European level is exactly that if you claim you're green, you need to prove it like after certain parameters. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're very much for legislation. I mean, as a consumer, I think certifications are not working, because we've seen that the sustainable fishing certificate is apparently not at all too sustainable. And so there is a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion for companies as to what really are sustainable practices. There's a lot of confusion for consumers. But you touched upon the topic of enforcement. Desiree said that's something that Europe really needs to learn, is to sock it to companies that are greenwashing. What can be done in the area of enforcement, Julia?
I would agree with the statements that have been made earlier throughout the day, and also throughout our panel discussion, that companies need to be held accountable. And for one, it's about the confidence of the consumer, that they understand what they're actually paying for, that there's transparency. At the same time, if there's misrepresentation, fraud, misconduct, that they get penalized, that they pay. And at the moment, it feels like there's a lot of self-definition going on. There's a lot of organizations signing up to standards and then defining on their own on what they're going to be, how they're going to be interpreting these. So if there is legislation, and if it's then standardized across different jurisdictions, that will make it easier both for the companies to comply with them, but also for the consumer to understand what that label actually means.
Mm-hmm. But Desiree was making the point that the fines need to be high enough for greenwashing not to be a risk that they can take into account. Is that the case in Europe, do you think?
I think, unfortunately, if we look at not just the environmental aspects of current media coverage, unfortunately, companies only tend to really take things seriously where they've seen severe enforcement that can hurt them in their practice, in their operations. Of course, it would be nice if, just from an intrinsic intuition, organizations would do the right thing, but I think we're not there yet. So yes, I would agree that there needs to be also a little bit more scrutiny and accountability and fines to help from that regard.
Nadine, what would you say? How can companies be held accountable for their misrepresentation of their green initiatives and credentials?
Well, I think what would be more important to me is, I think also in these terms of approaches, we need a culture where we listen more closely. meaning Thomas, he has described that. If I think of our members and if I have a company in mind that really has a great sustainability, human rights, and supply chain responsibility approach, to really explain how they do that, how they prioritize, how they do risk analysis, for example, it takes at least an hour, if not more, to really understand what the global concept is. And I often have the impression that it is complex to manage that in a global environment from the company side. And with many sustainability approaches, and sustainability professionals from all different kind of stakeholder groups would agree on that, is you never reach a state where everything is 100% perfect. I really want to see companies that are accelerating, that have ambitions, that are on their way. But what I miss personally is that we have room to really have an honest exchange on what is happening, what are companies planning, what are maybe the obstacles, and room for that discussion, and also for a mutual acceptance that we might not be perfect from day one, and companies might not be perfect on day one, but on their way. And I think that is a way forward. Otherwise, we will always be kind of locked in positions against each other in a way. Progression also, I mean, there are also people working in companies on all levels, also on top management. And what helps is, yes, of course, if really there's wrongdoing, then there should be frameworks where this can be flagged. But on the other hand, also incentives in terms of positive feedback for companies that are really doing great things. Mm-hmm. And that is at least, even if not more, motivating, I'd say.
Okay, thank you, Nadine. I take your point. However, I would say with the fossil fuel companies, where their business model is 96% of their business is burning fossil fuels and therefore increased CO2 emissions, that doesn't really play out like you've explained. But for other industries, perhaps. Did you want to add something to that, Ursula?
Very short, yeah. I do not really agree. I don't want to see companies on their way. I mean, we are in a climate crisis. We are in a biodiversity crisis. It's not new that we are in that crisis. And it's not new that companies trying to do good and trying to be sustainable. The Consumer Good Forum, where 400 companies are members, from Nestle to Mondelez to Rewe, they said 2010 they want to be deforestation free in 2020. They did not reach their goal. I don't want to talk about step by step and slowly transformation. It must happen now, and they must change their core business, and they must, be more active. And these transformative changes or reformative changes, step by step, this time is over. Yeah. It's over. Yeah. It's over that we do voluntarily some nice sustainable initiatives. There must be hard regulations. There must be the duty for companies to take the responsibility. Finally, I mean, about CSR, we talk about the 2000ers. Like in the European Union, the first directives or regulations come up like 22 years ago, and we're still talking about step by step. No, it's not step by step anymore. Yeah, time is over.
To underpin that point, the UN emissions gap report that came out at the end of last year says we're on track for 4%, was it, I think?
Even I read like
4 degrees warming by the end of the century.
Yes. So it's 16% more CO2 emission until 2030. So we're not on track. Yeah, okay. Absolutely not.
Thomas, did you want to add something to that?
I can only, agree. No, we're not on track. I'm also not an opponent of regulation at all. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've seen more movement over the last 2.5, 3 years than I have in the previous 17. So I'm glad this is happening. I do think there's a big potential enforcement gap, and I really hope that gets plugged. I would rather have, and I'm with Desiree Fixler there, I'd rather have more enforcement and less complicated regulation, and more kind of skilled enforcement of people who actually know what they're looking for and what they want to encourage. In the meantime, I do hope that the NGOs of this world kind of, John Elkington once called it the immune system of the planet that evolved when globalization kicked in, companies became more powerful, and then suddenly all these international NGOs popped up and started kicking corporates in their butts. And I do think that remains a really important part. And I do also think it's natural that there's friction between these two. I do think it's super important that we really hold companies to high standards.
Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting panel discussion. We will take some questions. We have some questions from the viewers, so let's have a look at those now, please, to the team behind the screens. Okay, so thank you, Rita Hatima Apostel, for your question. A favorite quote: growth is one of the stupidest purposes ever invented by any culture. We've got to have an enough. Always ask, growth of what and why and for whom and who pays the cost and how long can it last and what's the cost to the planet and how much is enough. I'm not sure what the question is. I think that's a statement, but yeah, let's go on to the next question. Or would any of you like to comment on that?
I mean, I can briefly comment.
Yeah, go on.
Growth is something that is frequently criticized in sustainable circles. I think what this quote illustrates is there are many kinds of growth. Yeah, there's growth in consumption and in supplies that doesn't necessarily have to go along with the increased use of resources. We would and should move towards an economy in which resources are circularized, and then we can achieve more for more people at lower cost to the environment. We're speaking of dematerialization of growth. A lot of growth right now is driven by technological innovations, which are primarily digital. They do consume energy, but they're not necessarily otherwise resource intensive. So growth per se is not evil, but we do need to take a careful look at how we rely on growth as the stuff that has got to get us all out of all kinds of trouble, which is still very much part of common political and macroeconomic rhetoric.
Okay, thank you for that, Thomas. Another question from our viewers. We'll have a look at the question coming up now. Terry Dawson, thank you for your question. So, do you think we excuse the bad actions too quickly? We all say we don't think that people set out to lie or mislead deliberately, but clearly in examples like Volkswagen, that was the case, and unintentionally misleading or misrepresenting, that surely is incompetence rather than innocence at best. Julia, would you like to answer that question? It's basically what Ursula is saying. It's no longer a good excuse.
Yeah, and I think I touched on it previously as well. It's you need to think about what are the statements that we're making and what is the purpose. And if it's then only to come ahead, then that might not be sustainable in that instance. So I think you do need to think about what is the purpose of your organization, what is the information, what is the footprint that you're leaving, and what is the data behind it before you make a statement. And you have the ability to collect the information before you put out a statement. And the environment that you're acting in and thinking everyone's doing it is not an excuse that you can have.
Okay, thank you, Julia. One more question, one final question now from the viewers. Let's take a look at one more. Thank you, Jane Arnott, for sending your question in. So, capital flows are being influenced by ESG performance. However, reporting is confined to the good stuff. Why are we allowing regulatory infringements to escape disclosure? Ethical investment funds rely on the media for a controversy rating rather than expecting disclosure of regulatory infringements. So that's basically saying we've got the media and investigative reporters as one of the tools, but why are we relying on that? Nadine, would you like to answer that?
I think I'm not so sure what I can say about that, but when I watch the drafts of regulation that are on the table, there will be more data we see on breaches also and information on that. So wait and see, I'd say.
Okay, Ursula, would you add anything to that? Why are we waiting for the media, basically, to...
Well, I think the media and the civil society is like the fourth power of democracy, so they need to have, they have a very important role. That's also what I highlighted in my presentation, that a lot of NGOs are coming too close to companies and maybe cannot fulfill their role anymore, so that must be kind of stopped or changed again. The question is relying on what data rather than media or civil society. That's the problem. I mean, I know, for example, of the timber regulation of the European Union to stop illegal wood coming into the European Union. There is still illegal wood coming into the European Union, even though we have this legislation, because there is not enough investment in authorities to check the wood coming into the European Union. So I wish that there is more investment in authorities, that they check it, that they also can provide the information for ESG ratings and so on. But so far, I think the media has a very important role as civil society. And that's why even media must stay independent or become independent again, because a lot of media is also bought by companies or politicians. We have a huge issue in Austria with that there are like big media have a lot of advertisement by big companies and dependent on that advertisement. So they must be also changed, that governments funding media enough, like on quality criteria, that they can fulfill their role as investigation. There's a lot to do, I think, but what else than the information of those two actors?
And perhaps also NGO funding shouldn't come from Coca-Cola, like with the COP27 coming up in Egypt, right? That's something like $200 million worth of
Yes, I mean, this is
subsidy,
also, I
apparently.
highlighted that greenwashing is not only about companies. Greenwashing is about research institutions, it's about international organizations as the United Nations, it's about government. Also the council meetings of the European Union was sponsored by big paper companies, by Pepsi, and they pay the European Union politicians like when they have the council presidency. That must be stopped. Like, companies should not pay for politicians, so that politicians tend to make laws for companies.
Okay, Thomas, one final statement, and then I think we need to wrap up.
Yes, thanks. See the zero thinking there. So I think it's a good question. Like your comments, one thing I want to add is, so the principles of balance and comprehensiveness have been part of sustainability reporting requirements for a really long time. Yeah, the idea is you don't leave anything unpleasant out, you make a balanced representation. These principles are going to find themselves into laws. Let's see how explicit it is. I think there's one actor that can do better on holding companies to account here, and that's the auditing community. I do think that the rigor of auditing, and particularly the degree to which people really look at, is this a balanced representation, and is all material information adequately addressed? That's a challenge I'd like to put out to the auditing firms to take more seriously, and if they don't, then to the regulators that are shaping that industry, because they need to play their part in the game.
Okay, wonderful. Dear viewers, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for sending in your questions, because that really creates a lively and lovely discussion here in the studio. Thank you, Julia, Thomas, Ursula, and Nadine. Thank you to you for joining us remotely and for sharing your insights. I really enjoyed this quite balanced discussion.